A massive ship cuts its way through the ocean at speed. It's 1931, and this mammoth new ocean liner is on its sea trials. She's the largest ship in the world by far, 80,000 tons and over 1,000 feet long, an absolute behemoth. This is the White Star liner Oceanic, the answer to a threat posed by German, Italian and French shipbuilders. For years, British merchant shipbuilding had progressed just fine, but a British-built ship had not held the title for the world's largest vessel since Titanic, way back in 1912, almost 20 years earlier. But now the same company that had owned Titanic introduced Oceanic, a triumph for British shipbuilding and an engineering masterpiece. Except, none of this ever happened. The Oceanic was a real project, but she would never be finished. It's an epic tale of greed, illegal dealings, poor planning, and just sheer bad luck, which would mean Oceanic would be abandoned after construction had started and be lost to history. Her story is intertwined with the death of the White Star Line itself. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and this is the true story of the Oceanic, the White Star Line's unfinished superliner. To understand where the Oceanic came from and why she was even planned in the first place, we have to take a little trip back to 1913. This was a crucial year for the White Star Line. This was one of Britain's premier shipping lines, and famously, or rather infamously, they were the operators of the RMS Titanic and her sister ships. The company had been doing swimmingly well in the 19th and early 20th century, dominating the transatlantic trade and faring well against its competitor, the Cunard Line, until April 1912, when the Titanic was lost. This was a devastating blow for the company, and it brought a number of massive changes. For one, J. Bruce Ismay resigned. He had been the chairman of the White Star Line and the president of the American company that owned it, called the International Mercantile Marine. Way back in 1902, Ismay had founded the company with three other huge shipping magnates of their various lines, big names like American, Red Star, Atlantic Transport and Leyland Lines. The whole thing had been bankrolled by financier J.P. Morgan, and the company formed agreements with German lines of the time as well. This left the Cunard Line standing alone in the face of an American-owned shipping juggernaut on the Atlantic trade. It received British government grants because of it. Then, in 1908, IMM's president Bruce Ismay proposed the concept of three new superliners to challenge Cunard Line's Lusitania and Mauretania. The result was Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic, three ships intended to re-establish White Star as the main force on the Atlantic run, but then it all came to a screeching halt. Titanic sank with Ismay on board, although he survived, and it became a public relations catastrophe and a major humiliation and shame to the IMM. But most importantly of all, Ismay was a shattered man. In 1913, he formally resigned from his position in IMM, but remained on as White Star's chairman, dedicating huge amounts of time to compensating Titanic survivors and victims' families. With Ismay gone for good from IMM, the company entered more of a slump. In 1913, its backer and owner, Morgan, died, and then a year later, the First World War erupted. Dozens and dozens of their ships were lost, and financial troubles bubbled to the surface. The company went into receivership, but it was saved. Sadly, the same couldn't be said of their largest vessel, the brand new Britannic, sister ship to Titanic. She sank in 1916 after hitting a mine. IMM and the White Star Line in particular emerged from the First World War missing a massive number of ships, and they were in a precarious situation. But then a champion emerged, RMS Olympic, Titanic's older sister ship. She had survived the war and multiple U-boat attacks, even managing to ram and sink a would-be attacker. The ship took White Star Line into the early 1920s with a boom. I've actually done a video on this before, it's a really interesting bit of history. She was paired with the older, smaller, and slower Adriatic, which was a weird partnership, but one that would have to do, because hundreds of thousands of people were fleeing Europe's carnage for new hope in America or Canada, or they went the other way, to seek out loved ones and a life in the old country. With Olympic, a 45,000-ton superliner serving alongside Adriatic, a ship just slightly more than half that size, obviously something drastic would have to be done to maintain that regular, scheduled service the White Star Line's customers expected. Although the two ships were lucrative in that first few years after the war, Cunard Line was much better positioned because they had emerged from the war with 2 liners of Olympics quality, namely Mauretania and the newer, magnificent Aquitania. It's probable that the White Star Line began to plot a running mate to Olympic at around about this time, something about the same size and capacity. But then, in 1920, the company purchased the German liner Columbus and renamed her Homeric. Fully overhauled, the ship went into service alongside Olympic in January 1922, but still, it was a weird pairing because Homeric was still about 10,000 gross registered tons smaller than Olympic and nothing like a true replacement for Britannic or Titanic. Now, later that same year, the company introduced the recently purchased German liner Bismarck, renamed Majestic. Now, this ship was actually bigger than Olympic, and at last, White Star Line had a pairing of ships that could tackle Aquitania and Mauretania. But Homeric was still the odd one out. Smaller, slower, and less glamorous, she still had a dedicated following, but she was nothing like the ocean-going celebrities that Olympic and Majestic became. White Star Line would need to build a 3rd ship to operate with Olympic and Majestic to seal the deal and complete the dream that Bruce Ismay had back in 1908, a trio of superliners flying the White Star Line's flag. In 1923, the company approached Harland and Wolff, their longtime partner and shipbuilders, with a brief: design such a running mate, something that would meet the expectations of the travelling public and live up to the standards set by the glamorous Olympic and Majestic. In January 1926, at the height of the Jazz Age, Harland and Wolff submitted a plan for a liner that served the purpose. And their submission was, to put it very simply, quite weird. The ship would be an enlarged, modernised Olympic, sporting the same 4 funnels, although larger, at about 905 feet in length and around 50,000 gross registered tons. The ship's stateroom layout and decorations would have been largely the same as Olympic. Probably the only major external difference was the introduction of a cruiser-style stern, which the company had employed on other ships like the Belgenland of 1914. This attempt at modernising the external appearance just didn't go far enough. Olympic's silhouette was unmistakably Edwardian, but that era had died with the First World War. 4-funneled liners were old hat. Whether this plan was ever seriously, formally considered is unknown, but we can probably assume the White Star Line, if they were ever presented the plans, rejected it. That same year, a 2nd planned ship was presented, one which took modernisation much further. Gone were the 4 tall funnels, and in their place was a trio of squat stacks with an overhauled exterior. Now, this would be truly a ship for the 1920s and 30s. She was bigger again, around some 935 feet or 285 metres in length, and around 50 to 60,000 gross registered tons. The International Mercantile Marine's then president, Philip A. Franklin, excitedly proclaimed that the new liner would embody the best features of Olympic and Majestic and bear a family resemblance. She'd be capable of about 25 knots, which was a blistering top speed, putting her in league with the legendary Mauretania, which still held the then speed record. But IMM and White Star would push the concept even further because a 3rd set of plans was presented by Harland and Wolff that called for an even larger ship. She'd be over 1,000 feet long and about 320 metres, the first ship to ever break the 1,000-foot mark. She would come in at a whopping 60 to 80,000 gross registered tons, and finally, for the first time in 20 years since Titanic had entered service, the largest ship in the world would be British built. She would symbolise a whole new era for the White Star Line, a company which had experienced a horrible run of bad luck, and therefore she'd be named Oceanic, an important choice because it had been the name of the line's first ocean liner. But then, before keel plates could be laid and the plans seriously actioned, something happened that would already seal the new liner's fate. In the late 1920s, the International Mercantile Marine was in a strange place. It was receiving grants for American-flagged ships, and then relations with the British lines began to sour. The IMM wanted to separate from its non-American lines, and the White Star Line was put up for sale. And the very future of the company was at stake, right at the moment that they were announcing plans to construct their magnum opus, the wonderful new Oceanic. It's now that I have to introduce you to a very colourful character, the man who came to White Star Line's aid in 1926, but who would ultimately end up running it into the ground and going to prison. His name was Owen Phillips, Lord Kylsant, a businessman and a keen shipping magnate all himself. He'd started out as an apprentice at a shipyard in 1880, but went on to found his own shipping company with the help of his brother some 8 years later. And over the next 25 years or so, he went about growing his business, purchasing one shipping company after another, until he had controlling interests in no fewer than 20. In 1924, he became a chairman of Harland and Wolff, White Star Line's main shipbuilder, so as a shipping man he must have seen the White Star Line as the ultimate prize. When it came up for sale at the end of 1926, he swooped on in. When it was coupled with his other lines, Kylsant then became the head of the largest fleet of ships on Earth. Like an excited kid with a new toy, Kylsant was eager to grow White Star Line and see it flourish. He gave the company the monopoly on transatlantic voyages from Southampton, and even gave them 2 new ships from his Royal Mail Steam Packet Company. Of course, he was delighted by the idea of introducing the world's largest ship. Oceanic would be the crown jewel in his vast new shipping empire. But Kylsant wasn't totally happy with the design just yet. He knew that the Germans were working on something hyper-modern, designs that would eventually become the Bremen and the Europa. Oceanic was finally ordered in June 1928, and construction began 10 days later, but the design was absolutely wild. Oceanic would be over 1,000 feet long, but to keep up with the competition, she'd need to be fast too. As such, her service speed would need to keep pace with the newer designs being introduced around the world. So to achieve this, the superliner would implement a radical new kind of propulsion. On conventional liners, boilers would turn water into superheated steam and drive it under extreme pressures into turbines. And then the fan blades in those turbines would drive a huge rotor connected directly to the ship's propeller shafts. This simple setup could harness the raw power of steam, but it had its limitations. For example, to go in reverse, it needed a complicated gearbox because the turbines could only spin in one direction, forwards. Steam was already beginning to be supplanted by a new form of propulsion anyway, the diesel engine. These monstrous piston engines were extremely efficient for their time, which was a huge benefit when Kylsant's shipping empire was in the throes of financial difficulties. We'll go through more on that in a minute. But diesel engines just weren't big and powerful enough yet to propel a liner in the 60 to 80,000 ton range. That would take a few more years of development. Oceanic would harness the new efficiency of diesels and the generative power of turbines and then combine them in a big way. The plan was for no fewer than 47 6-cylinder diesel engines to be coupled to generators, creating an enormous amount of electricity. Now these would then power 4 immensely powerful electric motors, providing a monstrous 200,000 shaft horsepower. Now the real benefit here, aside from the efficiency and the power, was the fact that the arrangement would do away with the complicated gearing, because the electric motors could operate in forward or reverse with ease. It would make the new ship extremely maneuverable, reliable, and cheap to operate. Kylsant was excited to implement the new propulsion system because it would mean Oceanic would be at the very cutting edge of technology for her day, aside from also being the largest and most luxurious ship in the world. But at that crucial moment, Harland and Wolff, the builders, refused. Even though Kylsant was the chairman, the key players that advised him were reluctant to use a new, untested propulsion system in such a big way. If it were to fail at that kind of scale, and in that sort of spotlight, it would be a disaster for everybody involved. Now this kind of fear didn't come from nowhere, because Harland and Wolff, and especially Lord Kylsant, had already just recently been embarrassed by biting off more than they could chew in exactly the same way. In 1926, Harland and Wolff had launched the liners Asturias and Alcantara for Kylsant's Royal Mail lines. The ships were powered by diesel engines, which were built under license by Harland and Wolff. But this was still relatively new technology. These were the world's largest motor ships. But at trials, the owners and builders were shocked to find that their new ships were badly underperforming. They were meant to be able to crack 18 or 19 knots, but they could only manage a pathetic 16.5, which was less than the old competitors' ships that were already in service on the same line. For example, French line's Lusitania could manage 20 knots, and she was almost 15 years older. It's a good thing Lord Kylsant was head of the builders as well as the owner of the flop ships, because otherwise, in a normal arrangement, the owners would flat out reject the builders' ships on delivery and the contract would go unpaid. Eventually, the pair would go on to be re-engined with more tried and trusted steam turbines, but in 1927, the failure was still fresh in the minds of Harland and Wolff, and it was a bitter one. Work on Oceanic was already going ahead slowly, but debates on the engines reached a head. In the end, Kylsant caved and a compromise was reached. Harland and Wolff were confident they had learned their lessons with diesel engines, and they were keen to put them to use on a vessel of Oceanic size. Their proposal was accepted. The Oceanic would be powered by 4 simply enormous diesel engines, each coupled to its own propeller shaft, using brute force to power the ship through the waves. This arrangement of diesels was aptly called the cathedral style because the engines stood so tall. It would make Oceanic the first 4-propeller-powered motor ship in the world, and by and away the largest motor ship yet built. It resulted in a peculiarity that would have been a funny characteristic of the ship though, because it would have meant that her forward 2 funnels would simply be dummies, and only the last one would have a light, wispy cloud of diesel fumes coming from out of it. The debate around the engines had a serious impact on construction. It had slowed so that only Oceanic's kill plates had been laid by 1929, while the issue was sorted out. And then, in October that year, the financial world shattered. The New York Stock Exchange collapsed and the world's major financial institutes were caught completely by surprise. The Great Depression had come at just the wrong moment for the White Star Line, and they and Oceanic might have survived, except that Lord Kylsant had been up to some financial trickery in the years before, in the hope that better years might see him and his shipping empire through. In short, Kylsant had come up with a model of acquisition. He would use large government loans to buy new shipping lines, and then use the revenue from those shipping lines to pay off the loan. But then he'd take other loans to buy other shipping lines, rinse and repeat. It had worked for a while, but by the mid-1920s, he was in some serious trouble. Loans were going unpaid, and the British government was beginning to put pressure on him. Right at the worst moment, with the government chasing him and his fleet of ships beginning to age, he had bought White Star Line and begun to spend even more. Maybe he believed that the company would be his salvation. Either way, he began to funnel funds into the company in the hope that it would grow exponentially. His eyes especially turned to Australia. He thought that a monopoly on that route would bring immense profit and financial stability, but it was a huge misstep. Kylsant spent a fortune buying shipping lines running to Australia, like Shaw, Saville and Albion Line, all the while covering his losses by moving funds around to make it look like everything was alright. The stock market crash caught him out. His companies defaulted on more loan repayments, and an investigation was launched. It revealed the sheer scale of his mismanagement. His company was £10 million in the hole. That's £537 million, or just over $1 billion in today's money. That's billion with a B. Not only had he been concealing that fact, but he'd actually been paying out dividends to stockholders despite trading at a loss. Now, this was deeply, deeply fraudulent behaviour, and it became a national scandal. He was arrested, went to trial, and found guilty because of the comprehensive paper trail that he'd left behind. Kylsant was sent to prison for just 12 months, and although the sentence is hilariously lenient, it was a death blow for the Oceanic, and especially the White Star Line. Throughout that whole debacle, the poor old Oceanic had sat unfinished on the stocks with just her keel plates, her backbone riveted in place, but not yet recognisable as a ship. To prevent corrosion, the assembly had been coated in a grease, but with Kylsant's arrest and the devastating Great Depression in full swing, the loans taken out to fund the ship's completion were diverted to 2 smaller liners, Britannic and especially Georgic. We'll come back to her in a minute. Oceanic's great keel was broken up, and the plates were recycled. The dream was finished. White Star Line had been caught in an awful position. Passenger numbers plummeted, and in simple truth, the line now had too many ships. The ships that they did have, by the way, were aging. Britannic, another diesel-powered motor liner, had been started before the Oceanic. Now funds for the cancelled project were put into her instead, and she entered service in 1930. She was the line's most profitable ship that year, but for the first time in its long history, the White Star Line recorded its first deficit. Then, another blow. The Australian government was owed a small fortune thanks to Kylsant's reckless spending. They demanded repayment, but the White Star Line couldn't cough up. Their Australian-run ships were seized and sold to another company, and one by one the old White Star liners were sold and scrapped. Baltic, Megantic, the Cedric, they were the first big ones to go. Even budget cruisers couldn't save them. By 1933, the company was essentially bankrupt, but then an unlikely figure tried to come to its rescue. J. Bruce Ismay stepped in and lobbied to assume control. He suggested he form it into a new company that would run smaller, more profitable ships like the Britannic, but the idea came to nothing. In the end, the government would force White Star Line and their old rivals, the Cunard Line, to merge. Cunard had been working on their own superliner project, but the work was halted also thanks to the Great Depression. With the merger successful, and Cunard having the controlling interest, White Star Line's superliner project, the Oceanic, was canned, and Cunard's ship was finished instead. She would go on to be named Queen Mary. White Star Line was never an equal partner in this relationship. Their champion liners of old, Olympic and Majestic, were retired. Olympic was sent to the scrap heap, and the Majestic was sold for a short stint as a training ship for the Royal Navy. The brand name was kept as a nod to tradition, but by the mid-1960s, no ocean liners were flying the White Star Line flag, and the name was finally retired for good. Oceanic had cost £150,000, that's £8 million, or nearly $10 million in today's money. But today we barely have anything to show for it. The original plans for the liner, the first two drawings submitted in 1926, have survived, but the final general arrangement plan has been lost to time. In the Second World War, Harland and Wolff was bombed, so they might have been destroyed, or they could have been simply thrown out when the project was cancelled. But either way, today we don't even really have a very clear idea of what Oceanic would have definitely looked like, but between Britannic and her running mate Georgic, we can get some idea. See, when Oceanic was cancelled, the funds were put towards finishing Britannic, but the White Star Line still needed a new liner to run alongside that ship. For this new ship, Britannic's design was scaled up, and some elements of Oceanic's external appearance were put into her. The new ship was named Georgic, and she would be the last ocean liner ever built for the White Star Line. So what if the Oceanic had actually been built? Well, it's kind of hard in between Kylsant's reckless spending and fraudulent activity and the Great Depression to imagine a world in which she would ever really be finished. Maybe if the construction had started earlier, if time hadn't been wasted arguing over the engines, she could have been in a much more advanced state of completion by the time the Depression hit. Cunard Line was always going to be the stronger company and have the controlling interest in such a merger. Financially, they were just in a far better state than the White Star Line, but crucially, at their head, they had the incredible, well-connected and savvy businessman Percy Bates. Maybe with the merger though, Cunard Line's superliner project would have been cancelled instead. Queen Mary would never have existed as we know it today. Instead, Cunard would have assumed control over the unfinished Oceanic, and she might have entered service in the company's colours. It's a tantalising thought, but firmly in the realms of fiction. Oceanic was almost doomed from the start. She'd been ordered by an ailing company, her final stages of design were overseen by a financial delinquent, and she was killed by the worst economic crash in modern history. But generations of Oceanliner nerds like me still can't help but imagine a world where Oceanic was the queen of the waves and the largest, finest ship afloat. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we get new videos out weekly. If you want to support my work and get really cool perks like behind the scenes and early access, please visit my Patreon in the link in the description below, or sign up as a YouTube member. Come and join the crew. As always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.